Welcome, I'm Steve Phillips. I would like to share with you the results of nearly 40 years of research into ancient history, starting here in this video presentation with a look at the Egyptian dynastic period, which supposedly lasted around 3,000 years. I shall here be pulling apart Manetho's cleverly contrived dynastic lists of Egyptian kings and queens, and reconstructing the Egyptian chronology according to what the written evidence in conjunction with the archaeological evidence is actually telling us. Be prepared for some shock revelations. So stay with me and all shall be revealed. Okay, before we proceed, I wish to stress that in this video presentation you will be bombarded with a lot of names which, unless you are an Egyptologist or someone who has spent a lot of time studying early Egyptian history, may probably not mean much to you, and which you may find overwhelming. Do not be intimidated by this, as the names in a sense are of secondary importance to the actual message being conveyed. Let the names just wash over you and focus instead on the arguments being presented, which I believe demonstrate how Manetho and his generation have managed to convince everyone of an extremely long Egyptian history. I shall, however, leave it to you to decide whether or not what I am telling you is correct. You might also want to watch my video, History Through the Ages, which shows that the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age progression, which most people take for granted as being established scientific fact, and which most archaeologists are still using for dating purposes, is totally spurious, being disproven not only by the written evidence, but also by the archaeological evidence, which quite clearly shows that these distinct ages simply did not exist. They only exist in textbooks and in the minds of archaeologists. Similarly, Egyptologists talk about the Egyptian Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom. I shall reveal that this simplistic breakdown of Egyptian history is also very misleading. I believe that the information contained in this video calls for a radical reduction in the Egyptian chronology, but see what you think. With these thoughts in mind, let's dive straight in with the evidence. No one has questioned or challenged what Manetho has told us. Consequently, archaeologists have consistently manipulated the archaeological data, albeit unwittingly, to fit Manetho's false chronological framework, with the result that what is presented to us as archaeological evidence today is in fact a confused mess of archaeological evidence which has been built around this false framework. Even when we examine the various other king lists which have been discovered, such as the Abydos king list, or the Turin king list, or the Saqqara king list, there are problems with every single one of them. The Abydos list, for example, jumps straight from Amenemnes IV of the 12th dynasty to Ahmose I, the first king of the 18th dynasty. In other words, it has omitted Sebek-Nofru of the 12th dynasty, the whole of the 13th and 14th dynasties, as well as the Hyksos period. The Turin king list, also referred to as the Turin canon, is our only source listing the 13th and 14th dynasty kings. And yet we accept these and Manetho's work without even a second thought. What we shall proceed to demonstrate is that all of these lists are contrived. In his book Centuries of Darkness, Peter James commented that the ancient Greeks and Egyptians were competing in trying to prove whose race was the oldest. As this, he argues, highlights a factor frequently overlooked in modern studies of ancient historiography, the desire to claim and demonstrate a venerable antiquity. What archaeologists do not seem to appreciate is that this desire to demonstrate a long and venerable antiquity was the prime motivation for producing these king lists. But the works of Manetho and these king lists are not the only problems we have to contend with. Early on, the Swiss archaeologist Edouard Naville issued the following warning. As the temples of the 12th dynasty had inscriptions only on the architraves and the doorposts, but not on the walls or the columns, it was easy for Amenophis or Ramses to use these flat and well-polished surfaces for celebrating his own glory, and thus attributing to himself the work of former generations. This warning by Edouard Naville has to date gone unheeded. Exactly the same problem is encountered in the Assyrian records. Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, for example, informs us, "But he who blots out my written name by means of some clever device, destroys my memorial or changes its location, may Ishtar of Erech look upon him in anger, decree an evil destiny for him, blot out his name and seed in the land." So what does he mean by clever device? Similar terminology is employed by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. "Whoever destroys the memorial on which my name is inscribed, and the names of Esarhaddon my father, blots out those names through some clever trick." Note that the removal of a name does not constitute a clever trick. It only becomes a clever trick when the name is being replaced with someone else's. In fact, Tiglath-Pileser I makes it even clearer when he writes, "But whosoever shall break my memorial tablets and my prism, or shall deface them, or shall cast them into the water, or shall cover them with earth, or shall throw them like," here the words are too broken to be read, but continues with, "into a pest house where they cannot be seen, or shall blot out my name which is written thereon, and shall inscribe his own name in place thereof, or shall devise any other evil scheme to do violence unto my memorial tablets." So this practice of removing whole lines of text and overwriting them at a later date was rife not only in Assyria, but in Egypt as well. Our first indication that something is seriously wrong with the Egyptian chronology is provided by the Greek writers. According to the Greeks, the Egyptian 12th dynasty was a great Egyptian empire and the most prosperous of all the dynasties. Egyptologists, however, will tell you that the 18th, not the 12th, was the great Egyptian empire. As the American archaeologist James Henry Breasted pointed out, apart from one solitary stela left to us by Senusert III's general Sebkhu, we have nothing to support the statement by the Greeks that the 12th dynasty kings controlled Syria. By contrast, the Greeks never once mention any of the achievements of any of the 18th dynasty kings. So why do we think that is? The answer will become obvious in a moment. Edouard Naville commented, "In every place where excavations have been made, either by our predecessors or by ourselves, if not statues or larger monuments, at least names have been discovered of the 12th dynasty, of the 13th, or even much more ancient kings belonging to the 4th or the 5th, but nothing whatever of the 17th or of the 18th. Except the Serpent of Benher, now in the Museum of Giza, and which dates from Amenophis III, before our discoveries at Bubastis, no monument of a delta could be attributed with certainty to those princes." It would be extraordinary, however, that wherever an excavation has been made, whether at Tanis, Pitom or wherever, especially in the localities where ancient monuments have been discovered, precisely those of the 17th and 18th dynasties should have disappeared. In short, monuments pertaining to the 12th dynasty are found in some parts of Egypt, whilst monuments pertaining to the 18th dynasty are found in others, but rarely do you find a combination of both periods. At Megiddo in northern Israel, the lower half of an inscribed Egyptian statuette and 2 Egyptian stelae were found in the temple platform. They mention the name of Tuthotep, a high official under Senusert III of the 12th dynasty. But they were found in a stratum which belonged to the time of Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty. In the south town of Tel el-Ayl in southern Israel, a town which Petrie identified as Gaza but is now believed to be Bet Eglaim, archaeologists found a carnelian bead bearing the name of Amenemhat and scarabs of Egyptian officials and a statuette of Khenti-u-Kha dating to the 12th to 13th dynasties. Yet none of the buildings in the area can be dated so early. Michael Avi-Yonah makes the following observation concerning the goldwork and pottery of Tel el-Ayl during the 12th and 18th dynasties. However, it seems that during the occupation of the first and second palaces, bichromeware and the presumably contemporary goldwork were in use. That distinctive pottery hardly penetrated into Egypt, and the application of granules onto gold plate was a technique that flourished in the later 12th dynasty, but was missing in the jewellery of Queen Akhetep, mother of Ahmose. It is not surprising that both of these skills, so foreign to Egypt, did not reappear there till the later years of the 18th dynasty. So, a distinctive style of pottery which made its appearance at the end of the 12th dynasty disappears and then makes a reappearance at the end of the 18th dynasty. Can this possibly be nothing more than coincidence? It is also interesting to note that Senusert III inaugurated a feast which was called the Feast of the Smiting of the Troglodytes, a feast which was supposedly reinstated in the 18th dynasty during the time of Thutmose III. Another similar coincidence is the fact that Senusert III is accredited with building a canal at Sechel in southern Egypt, which would have allowed unbroken water communication along the Nile with the country above, beyond what is known as the First Cataract. Thutmose I and Thutmose III are likewise said to have undertaken work on this same canal. In a moment we shall demonstrate that the 12th dynasty king Senusert III and the 18th dynasty king Thutmose III were one and the same person. Sir William Flinders Petrie wrote, "The works of the 11th and the 17th, or of the 12th and the 18th dynasties, when compared, are barely distinguishable." To put this into layman's terms, the 11th dynasty style gave way to the 12th dynasty style, which reverted back to the 11th dynasty style during the 17th dynasty, and then back to the 12th dynasty style in the 18th dynasty. The mathematical odds of this happening are a few million to 1 against. Basically, what we shall proceed to demonstrate is that the 12th and 18th dynasties, despite being dated 500 years apart, were one and the same period of history. Before we proceed any further, take a good look at the following statues, which are both representations of the 12th dynasty king Amenemhat III. Pay particular attention to the stylistic differences. Both statues are of the same king, albeit represented at different ages, but have clearly been done by 2 different sculptors. Note for example the exaggerated ears on the statue on the right. These differences in style are to be expected. With these thoughts in mind, take a good look at these statues. Let's play spot the difference. The ones on the left are statues of the 12th dynasty king Amenemhat I. The one on the right is the 18th dynasty king Amenhotep I. On the left, Queen Nefert, the daughter of the 12th dynasty king Amenemhat I. On the right, Queen Mut-Nefert, the daughter of the 18th dynasty king Amenhotep I. Regrettably, I have been unable to obtain a better picture of this 18th dynasty queen, so this is the best I can do with my limited resources. I would here point out that Mut is the Egyptian word for mother, hence for Queen Mut-Nefert we should more correctly read Queen Mother Nefert. On the left, statues and representations of the 12th dynasty king Senusert I, who succeeded Amenemhat I. We do not have any statues of the 18th dynasty king Thutmose I, who succeeded Amenhotep I, but we do have his death mask, his mummy, and a portrait of him as painted in bas-reliefs at Deir el-Bahri. A death mask is a face mask being a representation of the king whilst he was still alive, and which is placed over the face of the mummified king when he is laid to rest in his sarcophagus. Pay particular attention to the death mask and compare this with the statue of Senusert I. On the left, a statue of the 12th dynasty king Senusert II. On the right, a statue of the 18th dynasty king Thutmose II. Whilst not so convincing, pay particular attention in each instance to the roundness of the king's face. On the left, a portrait of the royal daughter Hatshepsut from the Stele of Au dated to the 12th dynasty, where she is called daughter of King Senusert. It has been assumed that she was the daughter of Senusert II. On the right, Queen Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, alias Senusert I. Queen Hatshepsut, whose prenomen has been read as Maat Kare, was called Nitocris by the Greek writer Herodotus. The interchange of the letters M and N in the Egyptian records is well attested. In the Alamana letters, for example, Neb Matre, this being the prenomen of Amenhotep III of the 18th dynasty, is variously called Nimoria, Imoria and Mimoria to list only a few variations on the writing of his name. The name which we have read as Maat Kare can therefore be read as Naat Kare, a name which, when transliterated into Greek, becomes Nitocris. Hatshepsut ruled from Thebes, whilst her brother Amenemhat II ruled from Lisht in the delta in the north of the country. On the left, a statue of Senusert II's successor, Senusert III. Bear in mind that Hatshepsut does not appear in the 12th dynasty king list, so Senusert III was supposedly the immediate successor to Senusert II. On the right, we have a statue of Menkaperre Thutmose, who has been identified as Thutmose III. Ah, but they are two different people, I hear you cry. And of course, you are right. The mummy of Thutmose III has been clearly identified as belonging to the 18th dynasty king Menkaperre Thutmose. The bandage wrappings are clearly of 18th dynasty manufacture, and the mummy is clearly labelled as belonging to Menkaperre Thutmose. Concerning this mummy, the renowned French archaeologist Gaston Maspero wrote, "His, that is Thutmose III's, statues, though not representing him as a type of manly beauty, yet gives him refined, intelligent features, but a comparison with the mummy shows that the artists have idealized their model. The forehead is abnormally low, the eyes deeply sunk, the jaw heavy, lips thick, and the cheekbones extremely prominent, the whole recalling the physiognomy of Thutmose II, though with the greater show of energy. Thutmose III is a fella of the old stock, squat, thick-set, vulgar in character and expression, but not lacking in firmness and vigour. We have more statues of Thutmose III than of any other Egyptian king, and it is abundantly clear when looking at them that they are representations of one and the same king. To suggest that these statues are idealized as suggested by Maspero therefore deserves to be firmly challenged. Basically, the statues which archaeologists are saying belong to Thutmose III are actually of 21st dynasty date and belong to Menkhpere Thutmose, the son of Penodjem I and brother to Susenes I of the later 21st dynasty. As you can see from these pictures, especially when you consider what we said earlier about allowing for artistic differences, you have to admit that these statues of Thutmose III bear a remarkable resemblance to Susenes I. In other words, the 21st dynasty king Menkhpere has usurped the monuments of the earlier 18th dynasty king of that name and has confused archaeologists by adding his own inscriptions to those monuments. There is every likelihood that Susenes was an alternative name for Menkhpere, seeing as how Susenes supposedly ruled from Tanis in the delta, whilst Menkhpere supposedly ruled from Thebes in the south. Sir William Flinders Petrie accredits Menkhpere with ruling not just over Upper Egypt, but possibly also controlling the Egyptian delta. In other words, Menkhpere would have exercised control over both parts of Egypt, thereby lending support to the idea that Menkhpere and Susenes were one and the same person. Whichever way you look at it, by identifying this 21st dynasty king Menkhpere as an 18th dynasty king, archaeologists have confused the archaeological strata of two separate periods of history, which in reality were around 500 to 600 years apart. This means that what they are calling 18th dynasty is in part to be redated to the 21st dynasty. Menkhpere Thutmose, son of Penodjem I, has appropriated the monuments of the 18th dynasty king of that name and has claimed for himself the works of the former king, which is precisely the sort of practice Edward Neville warned us of, but no one has paid him any heed. It should be noted that the mummy of Penodjem I, the father of the 21st dynasty king Menkhpere, was found in the usurped and damaged coffin of the 18th dynasty king Thutmose I. It was during the time of Penodjem I that work on restoration and preservation of the mummies of many of the earlier kings and princes, especially those of the 18th dynasty, was undertaken. Breasted tells us that the 21st dynasty kings respected the memory of their royal ancestors and vied with the high priests at Thebes in protecting the bodies of the emperors. By emperors, Breasted means the kings of the period currently under consideration, namely the 18th dynasty. At Medinet Habu, Penodjem I even placed inscriptions on the temple built by Thutmose III. All of this demonstrates that these 21st dynasty kings had a strange obsession with the 18th dynasty kings, and in some way tried to imitate them, perhaps in an attempt to restore Egypt's former glory. This included the appropriation of the monuments of these 18th dynasty kings and adding their own inscriptions to those monuments. Of Menkhpere's reign, Petrie commented that there are but few remains during this long reign of 48 years, which length of reign is guaranteed by a bandage dated in that year of Menkhpere on a mummy with a band of the first year of Penodjem II. Now, bearing this in mind, when we realise that Menkhpere has usurped the monuments of the 18th dynasty king Menkhpere Thutmose III, we suddenly discover that he has left a great deal more than just a few inscriptions. Many of the inscriptions assigned to the 18th dynasty king Menkhpere actually belong to this later king. Having cleared up this misunderstanding, We can now compare the mummy of the real Thutmose III with that of Senusert III, and we can just about see that they were one and the same king. This now fully confirms that the 12th and 18th dynasties, which are currently separated by around 500 years, were one and the same period of history. The 18th dynasty king Nebmatre Amenhotep III built a large pleasure lake for Queen T at a place called Zerucha, whose location is unknown. Note that in the Alamana letters, Amenhotep III is not called Amenhotep. He is variously called Nimoria, Memoria and Imoria, to name but a few of the variant spellings of his name. The only other king known to have constructed a large lake for his queen was Nemari Amenemhat III of the 12th dynasty. The lake in question was known as Lake Moeris, Moeris being the name by which the Greek writer Diodorus knew Amenemhat III. Notice that Nemare is a variant spelling of Nimuria, this being Amenhotep III's name as it appears in the Alamana letters. Amenemhat III's queen is only known to us from a stele discovered at Dakhshur, where she is called Oat. Oat, when read backwards, can be read as Teo or T. This is what is known as a metathesis, where sounds or letters in words change place. Metatheses were far more common in ancient languages than people realise. In all the old books on Egyptian archaeology dated to the 1800s, the name Senusert, the name of 3 of the 12th dynasty kings, was written Usertesen. It was subsequently discovered that the name had to be read from the inside out. The names Oat and T are just variant spellings of the same name. Although currently dated some 500 years apart, Oat and T were fundamentally one and the same person. Josephus called the Queen of Sheba the Queen of Egypt and Ethiopia. The Hebrew letter Shin can sometimes be transliterated as a T. Hence Josephus called the region of Bashan in northern Israel both Batanaean and Batanidi. When transliterated into Egyptian, the Hebrew words shofar, that is a ram's horn trumpet, becomes tupar. Saraf becomes taref, a name which has been interpreted as meaning magical serpent. And shasa, to rob or plunder, becomes tat or taut, and so on. The Hebrew word Sheba would likewise become Theba, which, when transliterated into Greek, becomes Thebes or Thebes. Queen Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty was the biblical Queen of Sheba. She ruled from Thebes, that is Sheba, whilst her brother Amenemhat II ruled from Lisht in the delta in the north. The epic voyage to the land of Pont, which occurred during the reign of Hatshepsut, was the selfsame epic voyage to the land of Pont which occurred during the time of Amenemhat II. Amenemhat II was a son of Senusert I, also known as Thutmose I, whilst Hatshepsut was a daughter of Thutmose I, also known as Senusert I. Note that Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled from Thebes in southern Egypt, is regarded as an 18th dynasty queen, whilst her brother, who ruled from Lisht in the delta, is regarded as a 12th dynasty king. This is how Manetho has managed to mislead everyone into believing in a long Egyptian history. It is from the time of Queen Hatshepsut onwards that King Solomon's proverbs appear in the Egyptian records. But because of the corrupted Egyptian chronology, they are dated far too early. This has prompted the French archaeologist Pierre Montet to make the following erroneous comments. We possess 2 almost contemporary works which belong to the category of moral and didactic literature. The maxims of the scribe Ani, whose touching remark about the love each man owes his mother is often quoted, and the moral treatise of Amenhotep in 30 chapters, which won instant fame as soon as it was published, because it was almost unanimously recognised as having served as a model for the Proverbs of Solomon. He also wrote, "The maxims of Amenhotep make it possible to see how much Israel owed to her long contact with Egypt." The earliest commentators were struck by the numerous analogies between the maxims and Solomon's Proverbs, particularly in the third part. The Hebrew sage leaves out the specifically Egyptian elements which abounded in his Egyptian model, but as regards essentials he follows Egyptian teaching. By correcting the Egyptian chronology, we overturn these statements, because it can now be shown that the Egyptians adopted their proverbs from King Solomon and not the other way round. And when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. And she came to Jerusalem with a very great train, with camels that bear spices, and very much gold and precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him of all that was in her heart. History is like a giant jigsaw puzzle. You place a few pieces in the wrong place and you end up with a completely disjointed picture. Put the pieces in the correct order and you obtain a more coherent picture, one which better fits the written documented evidence. When Queen Hatshepsut returned from Jerusalem, though the name Jerusalem does not appear in any of the inscriptions which have survived in Hatshepsut's bas-reliefs, she built a temple at Deir el-Bakhri based on the design of a temple built in Jerusalem by King Solomon. If you want some idea of what King Solomon's temple may have looked like, take a look at this temple. There were even 2 obelisks standing on the porch of Hatshepsut's temple, just like the 2 columns which stood in front of King Solomon's temple and which Solomon called Yachin and Boaz. Similar obelisks were discovered by archaeologists in front of the temple at Chatzor in northern Israel, though archaeologists are wrongly dating the temple and attributing it to the Canaanites. When Queen Hatshepsut arrived in Israel, she would have landed at Etzion Geber. She was there greeted by Perechu and his wife Iti. The name Iti appears to be a transliteration into Egyptian of the Hebrew word Ishti, meaning simply my wife. Perechu is the Hebrew name Peruach, and in 1 Kings 4:17 we read that Peruach's son Jehoshaphat was one of King Solomon's 12 officers. When you compare the skullcap of Peruach with the skullcap of this so-called Canaanite dignitary, we see that they are clearly related. This skullcap was specifically an Israelite form of headwear. Bear in mind that archaeologists are trying to convince us that the land of Punt was somewhere in South Africa. It would take far too long to present here all the evidence which shows that this assumption is false. This is covered in my book Ancient History Reconsidered, should you wish to explore this further. The fact is that Pont was the Egyptian word for Phoenicia, and Phoenicia has always been located in the land of Israel. In fact, because of Solomon's relationship with Hiram, king of Tyre, and because of the fleet of ships which Solomon had built, and whose navy included Phoenicians from Tyre, the land of Judah will, during that period of history, have been regarded as forming part of Phoenicia. This picture from Hatshepsut's reliefs, which depicts some of the furniture in the land of Punt, is quite enlightening. It is a shame that it is in such a fragmentary condition. Notice once again the man with skullcap. Now pay particular attention to this conical pot being held in someone's hand. This is the pot which contained the specimen of manna which Moses commanded to be placed in a pot as a sign for future generations. Compare this pot with the one depicted in Thutmose III's reliefs. This pot, which is labelled white bread, was taken by Thutmose III in his so-called Palestinian campaign. I would stress that the name Palestinian is the word archaeologists have used to refer to the whole of the land of Israel. In the Egyptian records, the name of the land is transliterated as Retenu. Bear in mind that we do not know how Egyptian words were pronounced. For example, Josephus called Ramses II Meri-Amun Armeses Miamun. Hiram, king of Tyre, is another example, as this name appears in cuneiform as Achiram. There are also a number of names in the Bible which, when we look at how Josephus has transliterated them, demonstrate that the modern pronunciations are not correct. As I have said, the land of Israel appears in the Egyptian records as Retenu. This name Retenu is clearly a transliteration of the Hebrew word Artsenu, a name which means our land. It can be shown that Thutmose III is the king who appears in the Bible as Shishak, king of Egypt. This is the king who appears in the 12th dynasty as Senusert III, and in the 13th dynasty as Sebkhotep III. I would here point out that the processes involved in the production of white flour is relatively modern. So the mention of white bread in Thutmose III's reliefs is enigmatic, unless you accept that it is referring to manna. Now notice the design and shape of this cornice, the form of which is similar to ones depicted amongst the items in Thutmose III's reliefs which he confiscated in his so-called Palestinian campaign. Now let us look more closely at the items confiscated by Thutmose III in his so-called Palestinian campaign. This is the pot we were looking at a moment ago and is labelled white bread. As you can see, there are a number of pots of similar design, but only the one is labelled white bread. Bear in mind once again that the process of separating the bran and germ from the grain to produce white bread is of relatively late date. We are not here talking of white bread as we know it, but rather the manna which was collected and is said in Exodus 16:31 to be like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. These cabinets are of the same style as those shown in Hatshepsut's reliefs which we were looking at a moment ago. This altar is labelled Great Altar. It is undoubtedly the altar which was made by Bezalel whilst they were in the wilderness. Why else would it be called a Great Altar? A 7-branched candlestick with an Egyptian servant inserted where the servant candle would be. The 7-branched candlestick was specifically of Israelite design, and the main 7-branched candlestick which Shishak did not remove from the temple was built in the wilderness according to the design given to Moses by the Lord. This alone challenges any suggestion that these items were confiscated from Canaanites. Gold chains with bricks still attached. This was the gold chain curtain which was fitted in front of the oracle or sanctuary. The Bible informs us that Rehoboam, king of Judah, became a servant to Shishak, king of Egypt, and that Shishak maintained hegemony over the land of Israel for many years afterwards. Thutmose III is the only Egyptian king to have conquered the land of Israel and to have maintained control of the land. He is understood to have retained control of these lands for approximately 50 years. Not even Shoshenq I, who is usually identified as the biblical Shishak, nor Ramses II can lay claim to having accomplished this long-term subjugation. According to Manetho, the 13th dynasty comprised 60 kings of Diospolis who ruled for 453 years, and the 14th dynasty comprised 76 kings of Sais who ruled for 484 years, though in one copy this is 184 years. No names are given for any of these kings, which itself should have been challenged. We are told that the Turin Canon is our only reliable source for these two dynasties. The Turin Canon is actually of late date, and seems to have been compiled around the same time as Manetho compiled his work. A list supposedly compiled by Thutmose III only covers a few of the names mentioned in the Turin Canon and is presented in a disorderly sequence. This list, which has been accredited to the 18th dynasty king of that name, actually belongs to a much later date. It might well belong to the time of Menkhepere Thutmose, son of Penodjom I, who we have already discussed and who belongs to the 21st dynasty. What has happened is that the 13th dynasty has become a dumping ground for archaeologists when they have not been able to fit the names elsewhere. For example, Sekhetebabre was the prenomen of the 12th dynasty king Amenemhat I. Petrie wrote, "Some scarabs bearing this name are so rude in workmanship that they cannot be assigned to the reign of Amenemhat I, in which fine work prevailed." Now, this is as good as saying that poor workmanship could not possibly have existed in the 12th dynasty, which argument does not stand up to scientific scrutiny. There are other names which have been dumped in the 13th dynasty and which more correctly belong to the 12th/18th dynasty, but it would take far too long to go through them all here. We shall, however, consider some of the more important names. Akhetabbu, the mother of the 13th dynasty, from whom the 13th dynasty kings descended, is here identifiable as Akhetep, the mother of the 18th dynasty kings. Akhetabbu is but a variant spelling of the name Akhetep. She was the wife of Amenhotep I, also known as Amenemhat I. The interchange of the letters P and B in ancient languages is well attested. Akhetabbu, Akhetep, phonetically they are both regional variations on the same name. We should bear in mind that in those days they did not have dictionaries. Names were written as heard. In the execration texts as they are known, she appears as Khetep. She was the mother of Amenemhat II, who was also known as Ameni. The 12th dynasty king Amenemhat II also appears in the 13th dynasty under the more convoluted name Ameni Antef Amenemhat. Under the name Antef, Amenemhat II appears in the 11th dynasty as an 11th dynasty king. Likewise, Dudimose I and II, who some archaeologists make 13th dynasty kings, whilst others would argue for them being 16th dynasty kings, are Thutmose I and II respectively, the name Dudimose merely being a variant spelling of Thutmose. The interchange of the letters T and D in ancient languages is also well attested. In the Alamana letters, for example, the king of Mitanni is called both Tushratta and Dushratta, both names being used interchangeably. The execration texts, as they are known, are a collection of Egyptian texts discovered on smashed pottery bowls and figurines, intended as a curse against their enemies. The Egyptians, as part of their magical practice of cursing, would inscribe the names of any potential foes on these items and then smash them to invoke the curse. It is generally agreed that these texts were written towards the latter part of the 12th dynasty or early 13th dynasty. This immediately causes complications when one considers that some of the curses are clearly against the 12th dynasty kings Senusert II and Amenemhat II. It would mean that the curses were made some 40 years or so after the deaths of the persons for whom the curses were intended, which surely cannot be right.
especially when one considers that some of the curses are in the future tense. For example, Ameni shall die, and Senusert the Younger called Ketu shall die.
These royal family members were therefore despised. As I have said, the name Ameni is a contraction of the name Amenemchat. According to Manetho, Amenemchat, who appears in Manetho's 12th dynasty list as Amenemes, was murdered by his eunuchs. Ameni did therefore die as per the curse. I would suggest that the eunuchs were only following orders from a higher authority. Herodotus tells us that Nitocris, a queen I am identifying as Maat-Kare or Naat-Kare Hatshepsut, exacted revenge on those responsible for her brother's death. I should perhaps clarify that Herodotus claims that she was an Ethiopian. By Ethiopian, he simply means that she was black, as were all of the 12th/18th dynasty rulers. The Egyptian priests told him that she avenged her brother. Despite the fact that he was their king, the Egyptians killed him and then handed the kingdom over to her. But in order to avenge him, she killed a lot of them by a trick. What she did was construct a massive underground chamber, and although in reality she had other plans, she claimed she wanted to hold an inauguration ceremony for it. She invited the Egyptians she knew to have been the ringleaders in her brother's murder, and there were quite a few of them, to the reception. While they were in the middle of the meal, she had the river flood in on them through a large secret passage. Bear in mind that Amenemchat II is the only king, apart from Apries, who lived a few centuries later, who is said to have been killed by his own people. Notice that Nitocris exacted revenge on a lot of the people responsible, so we are not talking of a small handful of people. If we think about it, for Nitocris, that is Naat-Kare Hatshepsut, to have gone to all this trouble to exact her revenge, the people responsible for her brother's death must have been powerful dignitaries who were highly influential in the affairs of government. The arguments being presented here show that the beginning of the 13th dynasty is a further duplication of the 12th/18th dynasty. The curses will certainly have been contemporary with the persons against whom they were intended. Without going into too much detail, the following people are named in those curses. Yakar Amo, king of Jerusalem. Yakar Amo is Hebrew and means esteemed or beloved of his people. The Bible even says in 1 Samuel 18 verse 16 that all Israel loved David. The names of the three captains mentioned in the execration text are also Hebrew. Zebulun, or if you want to use the anglicised form of the name, Zebulun, who is otherwise unattested during the time of King David, unless of course it is referring to the tribe of Zebulun. Cushah, which is but a variant spelling of the name Achishar, this being the name of the steward over the royal household during the time of David's successor Solomon. And Ahobam, which is a variant spelling of the Hebrew name Joab, a name which is written as Joab in the authorized version. For this form of the name, which has an extra letter M on the end of it, consider the fact that Rehoboam's son and successor is called Abiam in the first book of Kings, but Abiah in the second book of Chronicles. Joab was one of King David's captains right up until the time of King Solomon. Professor Pritchard was not too far off the mark in suggesting, in a footnote on page 329 of the 1969 edition of his book, Ancient Near Eastern Texts Relating to the Old Testament that is, that the name is equivalent to the Hebrew name Eob, a name which appears in the authorized version and pronounced by most people as Job. As a word of caution, though, I notice that earlier editions of this book do not contain this comment. This entry in the 1950 edition of the book simply says that the translation has given some of the personal names an Asiatic cast. The Egyptian shows Eobem.
the retainers or trusted men of Yisipi is unmistakably a reference to the house of Joseph, which comprised the tribes Ephraim and Manasseh. During the time of Kings David and Solomon, we are informed in 1 Chronicles 9 verse 3 that Ephraim and Manasseh were dwelling in Jerusalem. Achimatzmu, who is called chief of the Setiu in one text and chief of the Shosu in another, is the biblical Achimaaz, who is said in 1 Kings 4 verse 15 to have married Basmat, one of Solomon's daughters. Once again, note the additional letter M on the end of the name. The prince of Shimunu is clearly a reference to the tribe of Shimon, a name which is written Simeon in the Authorized Version. The French archaeologist George Posner even commented on the fact that the name is related to the Hebrew name Shimon, but clearly could not make such a connection with the tribe of Israel, whose progenitor, according to their reckoning, had not yet even been born. Achiram, ruler of Anak. Professor Pritchard enthused that this was the first mention of the Anakim ever found in the Egyptian records. Achiram, however, is here to be identified as Hiram, king of Tyre. The name Eanak has absolutely nothing to do with the Anakim mentioned in Deuteronomy 9 verse 2. Eanak is Hebrew for Great Isle, and refers to the island city of Tyre, which Josephus tells us was an island city during the time of King Solomon. It should be stressed that these curses are all directed at the king of Jerusalem and those regions of the land of Israel which were allied to Jerusalem during the time of Kings David and Solomon. During this period, Israel was fast becoming a powerful and prosperous nation. The evidence being presented here is confirming the biblical record. But because of our corrupt understanding of Egyptian history, this evidence of David's and Solomon's influence over the nations has been pushed back in time, thereby disassociating them from their true place in history. Is it no wonder then that archaeologists have not been able to find evidence of David's and Solomon's influence in the archaeological records? Is it no wonder then that there are archaeologists who are claiming that the Bible is wrong? As you can see, there are enough indicators here to show that the Egyptian 12th/18th dynasty was contemporary with the Davidic Solomonic period. But archaeologists are not prepared to question or challenge the Manethonian tradition. Because of this, the Egyptian chronology is in a mess. It has been inflated beyond all recognition, and archaeologists are constantly adding to the general confusion by adding new names to an already highly contrived chronology. This scene supposedly depicts Asiatics visiting Egypt to sell their wares. It is taken from the 12th dynasty tomb of Khnumhotep II at Beni Ghassan, and dates to the 4th year of Senusert II, who we have identified as the 18th dynasty king Thutmose II. Senusert II, also known as Thutmose II, ruled immediately prior to Queen Hatshepsut, which dates this scene to the latter part of King David's reign. The man holding what looks like an ibex is called Chief of the Setiu. His name is given as Abshai, or more correctly Abishai. That's his name written in hieroglyphics. Abishai was King David's nephew. He was the son of Zeruiah, King David's sister. The man on the bottom register is holding an 8-stringed lyre, an instrument which is mentioned countless times in the book of Psalms. It is extremely likely that this instrument was one of King David's inventions, as we are told in 1 Chronicles 23 verse 5 that 4,000 praised the Lord with the instruments which I made, said David, to praise therewith. Similar references to these instruments David made are present in a number of other passages, including 2 Chronicles 5 verse 1, 7 verse 6, 29 verses 26 and 27, as well as Nehemiah 12 verse 36 and Amos 6 verse 5. Here we see Israelites bowing down before the treasury official during the time of Thutmose IV of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. Note how they all have pointed beards. According to the Egyptian records, the men of Punt or Phoenicia were renowned for these pointed beards. Compare this picture with that of Abishai and his entourage. And this picture of Israelites from the tomb of Rechmir, who was vizier during the time of Thutmose III. This is what the Bible means when he says that the Israelites are not to cut the corner of their beard. Because of this corruption of our understanding of the Egyptian history, these Israelites are simply dismissed as being nothing more than Asiatics. Also, many of these so-called Asiatics have fringes on the corners of their clothing. Again, this is a biblical commandment. Some of the people even have a visible blue thread in their fringes. Again, this is a biblical commandment. The 13th and 14th dynasties are therefore shown to be spurious, whilst the 12th and 18th dynasties, as we have shown, were one and the same period of history. Bear in mind that the 12th and 18th dynasties were supposedly separated by around 500 years. Also, we are demonstrating that the 12th dynasty is being dated around 1,000 years too early in relation to the biblical chronology. So is it no surprise that archaeologists cannot find evidence of Israel's sojourn in Egypt or evidence of their exodus from Egypt when they are not even looking in the correct eras? The deceptions continue with the Egyptian 4th dynasty. The Greek writer Herodotus was the earliest writer to compile a brief history of the Egyptian people. This was long before Manetho produced his highly contrived dynastic king list. Herodotus placed Cheops at the end of the 12th dynasty. Egyptologists, however, simply dismiss his version of Egyptian history in favour of Manetho's contrived chronology. Note that Cheops is called Khufu by archaeologists, Cheops being the Greek form of the name. Having demonstrated that the 12th dynasty was but the 18th dynasty in another form, we can now demonstrate that the 4th dynasty is a repetition of the latter part of the 12th/18th dynasty. In discussing the 18th dynasty king Akhenaten, Cyril Aldred could not have been closer to the mark when he wrote, "It would be surprising if this cataclysm in the affairs of Egypt had not left some mark upon the folk memory of its inhabitants, and what appears to be a dim recollection of the great event of Akhenaten's reign is transferred to the time of Cheops and his brother Chephren." By cataclysm, Aldred is referring to a complete breakdown of Egyptian society. Aldred records that the king's officials had become corrupt and extortionate through the delegation of too much power. No one Egyptian king has become quite so despised or so well known as King Cheops, or Khufu as he is better known in archaeological circles. The conflict between Cheops' two sons, Kawab and Radedef, reflect the situation between Akhenaten's two sons, Smenkhare and Tutankhamun, though for the sake of expediency we shall not go into that conflict here, as it would be too much of a deviation from what we are trying to achieve. We learn that Radedef murdered the crown prince Kawab in order to gain the throne. It can be shown that Tutankhamun likewise killed his brother Smenkhare. But again, it is not the intention to go into the detail here, as it will take too long to explain. For this exercise, we just need to be aware of the correlation between the 4th and 18th dynasties, which were supposedly separated by more than 1,000 years. If we compare the 4th dynasty with the relevant part of the 18th dynasty, we arrive at the following correlation. Cheops, or Khufu, is the king we also know as Akhenaten. Note that Akhenaten was called Horus by Josephus. In the Alamana letters, discovered at Tel Amarna in Egypt, Akhenaten was called Hurriya, king of Egypt, by Suppiluliuma, king of Khatina. Horus is actually the Greek transliteration of this name Hurriya. Kawab appears in the 18th dynasty as Smenkhare. Radedef, who is called Kheretetef in the papyrus Ani, appears in the 18th dynasty as Tutankhamun. Note that Tutankhamun was called Rathotis by Josephus, this being a transliteration of the name Radedef or Kheretetef. Khephren or Khafre appears in the 18th dynasty as Ai, whose full name is usually read as Kheper Kheperura Itznut Ai. Because there are no vowels in the Egyptian hieroglyphic alphabet, this name can also be read as Khafre Khafre Ra Itnut Ai. Instead of calling him Khafre, however, archaeologists have decided to call him Ai. Note that Nebmatre Amenhotep III is not called Amenhotep in the Alamana letters. He is called Nimuria, which is a variation on the name Nebmatre, the first part of his name, which is known as the prenomen. On this basis, Ai would likewise be known by the common name of Khafre rather than Ai. To add to this overwhelming evidence, I would mention that at Amarna in Egypt, this being the location of Akhenaten's city, the excavators discovered parts of 3 stone bowls inscribed with the names of Thutmose III, Amenhotep III and Khephren. Whilst the first 2 names were to be expected, the last of these was not. Now, why would someone inscribe a bowl with the name of a king who was loathed and who had supposedly died around 1,000 years earlier? This is a statue of a young Khafre Ai of the 18th dynasty. Note that the nose has been restored, so the nose is not part of the original statue. Whilst perhaps not totally convincing, on either side for comparison I have shown 2 differing representations of the 4th dynasty king Khafre. Allowing for age differences and stylistic considerations, even though Khafre Ai has more slender cheeks, one can perhaps just about make out that they are representations of the same king. Khufu's city was called Menat Khufu, a name which the renowned American Egyptologist James Henry Breasted translated as Nurse of Khufu. But why would Khufu name his city Nurse of Khufu? In Hebrew, Manat means a portion or something set aside. In the Book of Chronicles, for example, we are told that Hezekiah appointed also the king's portion. The word translated as king's portion is Manat HaMelech. Menat Khufu would therefore more correctly mean the portion of Khufu, land which had been set aside for the king. Breasted also tells us that this city of Menat Khufu was located in some indeterminable place near to Beni Hassan. In fact, much of the alabaster used by Khufu for many of his monuments was obtained from a quarry not far from Tel Amarna. It is at Tel Amarna, a city located about 24 miles south of Beni Hassan, that Akhenaten built his city of Akhetaten. Having demonstrated that the 4th dynasty is the latter part of the 12th/18th dynasty, and that Khufu was an alternative name for Akhenaten, it becomes apparent that Menat Khufu will have been an alternative name for Akhenaten's city, Akhetaten. We can see on this map precisely where Akhenaten's city was located in relation to Beni Hassan. This then was the city which was also known as Menat Khufu. Basically, Manifu's 4th dynasty is the latter part of the 12th/18th dynasty in another form. The 3rd dynasty can likewise be shown to be the first half of the 12th/18th dynasty, though I do not think that we need to concern ourselves with that in this video. Before moving on, Let us consider a statuette which Sir William Flinders Petrie identified as the 4th dynasty king Khufu. As you can appreciate, this statuette looks nothing like Akhenaten. So if Khufu was another name for Akhenaten, how can this anomaly be explained? First and foremost, is the statuette really of Khufu? Let us reconsider the evidence. Actually, we do not need to look very far for an answer. The Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass disagreed with Petrie's dating of this statuette. He writes, Petrie immediately dated this statuette to the 4th dynasty on the basis of the name inscribed on the throne, convincing all subsequent archaeologists and art historians of the validity of his assertion, and dismissing as superfluous any thought of comparison with 4th dynasty sculpture. I disagree with this dating and believe instead that the statuette was manufactured in the 26th dynasty, also known as the Neo-Memphite period.
We have therefore now removed the only obstacle preventing us from identifying Akhenaten as Khufu. Having identified Queen Hatshepsut of the Egyptian 18th dynasty as the biblical Queen of Sheba, and Thutmose III, who is also known as Senusert III, as the biblical Shishak king of Egypt, it follows that Amenhotep III, who was also known as Amenemhat III, will have been a contemporary of Ahab and Jehoshaphat, kings of Israel and Judah respectively. Akhenaten, who was also known as Khufu, will then have been a contemporary of Jehoram son of Jehoshaphat, and so on. Working our way forward in time, this means that the Egyptian 5th and 6th dynasties, which came immediately after the 4th dynasty, seeing that the 4th dynasty is a repetition of the latter part of the 18th dynasty, were contemporary with Ahaz and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. It is a known fact that these two kings of Judah were contemporary with Shabaka and Taharka of the Egyptian 25th dynasty, this being known as the Ethiopian dynasty. With this in mind, let us now look at the evidence which confirms that the Egyptian 5th and 6th dynasties were in fact contemporary with the Ethiopian 25th dynasty. The 4th dynasty king Khafre was succeeded by the 5th dynasty king Menkaure. We know that there was a king Menkaure who was a contemporary of the Ethiopian king Shabaka of the 25th dynasty. No known scarabs have been found which belong to this supposedly earlier king Menkaure of the 5th dynasty, most of them having been assigned to the king of this name who lived during the time of Shabaka. A problem was also encountered with Menkaure's pyramid at Gizeh, this being the 5th dynasty king of this name. The sarcophagus contained a mystery. A wooden coffin inscribed for Menkaure as though it was the coffin in which he was laid to rest, but its style dates it to the Sayyid period at the very earliest. The Sayyid period supposedly started around the 7th century BCE. This is when the 25th dynasty kings are said to have ruled Egypt. Some objects belonging to the 5th dynasty king Zedkare were reassigned to the Ethiopian king Zedkare Shabbataka of the 25th dynasty when it was realised that they were of the same Ethiopian style. Despite the redating of those items, the 5th dynasty strata from which those items were sourced is still being regarded as belonging to the 5th dynasty. Scarabs belonging to the 6th dynasty king Neferkare Pepi II were reassigned to the Ethiopian king Neferkare Shabaka of the 25th dynasty when it was realised that they were of that same Ethiopian style. Sir William Flinders Petrie also informs us that many items of pottery in museums, these being mainly alabaster vases bearing the cartouche Neferkare, and which have been dated to the 6th dynasty, more correctly belong to the Egyptian 19th dynasty, that is, the Ramessid period, which, as we shall proceed to demonstrate,
was initially contemporary with and immediately followed the Egyptian 25th dynasty, which was an Ethiopian dynasty. Probably one or two may be genuine, but most of them have forged names on genuine vases, the very shapes of which show that they were made in the 19th dynasty rather than in the 6th dynasty, he wrote. Despite the redating of those items, the 6th dynasty strata from which those scarabs and pottery were sourced is still being regarded as belonging to the 6th dynasty. When archaeologists tell us that Egypt had strong links with the Levant as early as 3000 BCE, they are ignoring the fact that Petrie redated the strata to the Ethiopian period, this being the 7th century BCE. According to Barry Kemp, during the time of Shabaka, the Egyptians had a working knowledge of an archaic form of the language and were guilty of forgery. This statement, however, should be treated with caution, as I am demonstrating that the 5th and 6th dynasties were contemporary with the Egyptian 25th dynasty, which was an Ethiopian dynasty ruled by Ethiopian kings. Note that the 4th, 5th and 6th dynasties are referred to by archaeologists as the Egyptian Old Kingdom, meaning that this archaic form of the language was not actually archaic. Having demonstrated that the 5th and 6th dynasties, which are supposed to be Old Kingdom dynasties, were contemporary with the 25th dynasty, which is supposed to be a New Kingdom dynasty, the following information provided by William Stevenson Smith is very enlightening. Bear in mind that Taharqa is a 25th dynasty king. On the back of the pylon of Taharqa's temple at Kawa, under a colonnade of palm columns reminiscent of the 5th dynasty funerary temple of Saqqara at Abusir, are carved sunk reliefs which reproduce the Old Kingdom version of the king as a sphinx trampling on his enemies, as it is found in the temples of Saqqara, Ner-Yuzurah and Pepi II. They even show the family of the conquered Libyan chieftain, with the names of the wife and 2 sons, which in Dynasty 6 were copied from Saqqara's representation by Pepi II. Now, admittedly, this might just be a straight copy as suggested by Stevenson Smith. But if these kings were contemporaries, as I am disclosing here, then is it not logical to assume that what we are looking at are 3 kings who were involved in the same campaign, all recording their own version of the events? In fact, I have every reason to believe that Pepi I was an alternative name for Shabaka. This would then place Pepi II as a contemporary of Taharqa. And if I am right, then both Saqqara and En-Yuzurah, who is called Ner-Yuzurah by Stevenson Smith, were also contemporaries of Taharqa. So let's just stop for a moment and reflect on what I am saying. The 12th dynasty has been classed as a Middle Kingdom dynasty. But I have demonstrated that the 18th dynasty, which has been classed as a New Kingdom dynasty, is in fact the 12th dynasty in another form. I have now also demonstrated that the Old Kingdom is the latter part of the 12th/18th dynasty in another form, which means that the Old Kingdom actually succeeded the Middle Kingdom as well as the early part of the New Kingdom. Bear in mind that these classifications have been imposed on the archaeological evidence by archaeologists. Manetho did not use these classifications. This method of dating, according to Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom styles, is no better than the assumed Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age progression, which I have already shown to be spurious in my video History Through the Ages. We are looking at a pseudoscience. All of this calls for a radical rethink of the dating methods being employed by archaeologists. The argument that the bold, brash style of the Old Kingdom represents an earlier style than that employed in the Middle and New Kingdoms now falls apart. As far as the Old Kingdom is concerned, what we are actually looking at is a change in style as a result of a collapse of the Egyptian society, this being due to instability caused by invasion of the land by both the Ethiopians and the Assyrians. We are also looking at differences in style which will have occurred in different parts of Egypt. Bear in mind that the 5th and 6th dynasties are supposed to have occurred around 1500 to 1800 years earlier than the 25th dynasty. Hopefully you can now begin to appreciate what Manetho has done and how the Egyptians of his time have managed to convince everyone of an extremely long Egyptian history. I have tried hard to keep this video from becoming too large to manage. By now your brain has probably already reached information overload. Trying to process something like this is very difficult, especially when you get all these different names thrown at you. It does not help when archaeologists cannot even agree amongst themselves how the names are to be written. Whilst some archaeologists refer to Penujum and Susenis of the 21st dynasty, for example, others call them Panozum and Sebkhanu respectively. I have used the name Tutmos for the 18th dynasty kings of this name, though you will also find this name written either as Tutmosis or Tehutmes or as Tutimos. Petri preferred Tehutmes. When we look at the names recorded in Manetho's long king lists, it becomes even more confusing. This is Manetho's 12th dynasty compared to what archaeologists have constructed from the archaeological evidence. Note that Manetho has omitted both Amenemhat I and Senusert II. Now that I have demonstrated that the 12th and 18th dynasties were one and the same period, it should be noted that Amenemhat III did not immediately succeed Senusert III as Manetho would have us believe. The reigns of Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV occurred after Senusert III and before Amenemhat III. Now take a look at Manetho's 18th dynasty. Ahmose I and Amenhotep I have both been omitted at the beginning of the dynasty, though Africanus starts his list with someone called Amos, who Petri, in Volume 2 of his History of Egypt, identifies as Ahmose I. If that is so, then Africanus has omitted Amenhotep I and Thutmose I. We know that Thutmosis, who appears at the beginning of Manetho's 18th dynasty, is Thutmose I, also known as Senusert I, because his son Hebron is clearly Thutmose II, whose prenomen has been read as Acheperen-Ra, a name which can also be read as Achebron-Ra. Sir William Flinders Petrie also came to this same conclusion in his assessment of Manetho's 18th dynasty list. The interesting thing to notice is that Amenephis, the successor to Hebron, is clearly Amenemhat II, but you will not find him represented in the list of kings who have been accepted as forming part of the 18th dynasty. Note also that Hatshepsut is called Amese, the sister of Amenephis, so Amenephis can only here be referring to Amenemhat II. Petrie, on the other hand, assumed that Manetho had misplaced Amenhotep I in his list, but failed to explain why Hatshepsut should be called sister of Amenhotep I, who was actually Hatshepsut's grandfather. This name Amese is enigmatic. To date, we have not found anything which shows that Hatshepsut used this or any name which remotely resembles it. I would also point out that Amese has been omitted in Eusebius' copy of Manetho's 18th dynasty list. And then there are these names Mefres, called Misafris by Africanus, and Meframutosis, called Misfragmutosis by Africanus, who Petrie correctly identifies as Thutmose III and Amenhotep II respectively. The evidence shows that Thutmose III ruled for around 54 years. Yet Manetho, who called Thutmose III Mefres, only accredits him with a reign of 12 years and 9 months. As Petrie comments, the 54 years reign of Thutmose III cannot be identified with any of the numbers of the list, so wherever it is placed, some corruption must be assumed. This is how deceptive these king lists actually are. Sir Alan H. Gardiner even commented that the 7th dynasty appears to be wholly spurious. And yet archaeologists cannot seem to let go of this false chronological framework. Manetho's dynastic lists of Egyptian kings and queens is one big con, and everyone has fallen for it hook, line and sinker. Coming up in part 2, I shall demonstrate that the Egyptian 19th dynasty, often referred to as the Ramesside period, coincided with the final years of the Judean kingdom, Seti I being the king Herodotus called Sethos and who was a contemporary of Sennacherib, king of Assyria. It is a known fact that the Ethiopian king Shebaka was a king of Egypt during the time of Sennacherib, when Hezekiah was king of Judah. I show, however, that another Shebaka was king of Egypt during the time of Alexander the Great. Artifacts belonging to this later Shebaka have automatically been assigned by archaeologists to the earlier Shebaka who lived a few centuries earlier, thereby throwing confusion on the archaeological record. The Greek writer Herodotus describes a temple built by Shebaka which is readily recognizable today. But the temple in question has been assigned to another king, Osorkon II, who, I shall demonstrate, lived during the late Persian and early Hellenistic period. Archaeologists have not realised that Osorkon II has appropriated this temple belonging to Shebaka and has claimed it for his own glory. A tomb belonging to Achiram, king of Tyre, has been assigned to the Hiram, who was king of Tyre during the time of Kings David and Solomon. I demonstrate that this tomb actually belongs to the king of this name who was cruelly put to death by Nebuchadnezzar II a few centuries later. So once again, the archaeological record has been thrown into confusion because of this wrong interpretation of the evidence. So join me for part 2 for more enlightenment.